Good morning. Happy to have you with us. We are continuing our study of healing and wholeness in the Bible, and we've been looking at some Old Testament passages, and we'll do the same today. The passage is 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. It's a long passage. Chapter 5, 2 Kings, verses 1 through 14. Now, Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram, or Syria. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means, go," the king of Aram or Syria replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read this letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message, "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house in Samaria. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more than when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. People in pain want help. Whether that pain is from emotional or physical scars, Jesus encountered people in pain all the time, such as the man who had leprosy and the sick servant of a centurion in Matthew 8, verses 1 through 13. These people were desperate, and so was an Old Testament character by the name of Naaman. He was in need of healing, and he was healed in a rather unusual way. That way and that healing changed his life forever. And this morning's message will remind the listeners that God's ways are not our ways, but following them can change our life forever. Let's look at the characters in today's story before we go into detail with regard to each and every verse. First we have Naaman. Who was he? He was the commander of the Syrian army. He was a valuable and well-respected person in the eyes of both his master, the king of Syria, and his servants. But yet, he had a serious physical problem. He was a leper. Then we have the young girl from the land of Israel. Now she had been taken captive in a raid previously by the Syrians, and now served as a handmaiden to the wife of Naaman. Now living as an exile in a foreign country, she was quite remarkable because of her spiritual qualities. Then we have the king of Israel, that's Jehoram by name. Most probably he was the son of the wicked king Ahab, and he was known, Jehoram, for his pessimism, his unbelief, his despair, and his suspicion. Then we have the king of Aram or Syria. He is Naaman's master, and he is the one who supported Naaman in his efforts to get well. And then we have the prophet Elisha of Samaria. He was the spokesman of the living God. He was noted for his simplicity and his decisiveness toward both the kings of Israel and Syria. He's a pivotal character in the story. All right, having set forth the characters in the story, let's look at the passage in detail. The author here begins by telling us how great Naaman was. He was a giant in the mind of his master, the king of Assyria. Naaman had been highly successful in leading the Syrian armies in their attacks against Israel. Yet, although he was a great leader, the verse goes on to tell us that his military success was not primarily the result of his own courage or military skills, but the result of God. It was all according to God's sovereign plan and purpose. The verse states, "For through him the Lord had given Syria military victories." Notice, the Lord had given Syria. Naaman's success in his battles with Israel were simply the implementation of God's judgment on Israel because of the sins of its people. Naaman was only God's instrument in the carrying out of that judgment. The verse goes on, he had leprosy. As great as he was, Naaman had one very serious problem. He had leprosy. As most of us know today, during biblical days, leprosy was a dreaded, contagious, and incurable disease. Victims were usually quarantined. They were not allowed to live in the city. Naaman, however, was not affected by this at this time because it's possible that his leprosy had not yet advanced to a serious stage, or at least was not yet a severe one. Potentially, though, there was hardly a disease which could be more devastating to him. It would eventually mean the end of his military career, and in time, perhaps his life as well. It is certain that he had sought every possible cure that was available in Syria, but with no success. Verse 2 goes on to describe what happened to the young girl. Earlier, bands of Syrian raiders had kidnapped and sold the young girl at the slave market in Damascus. And this was one of God's curses against his people for their sins. Moses had already predicted this when he said in Deuteronomy 28:32, "Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, and your eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all day long, and there shall be no strength in your hand." And this is why the young girl had ended up in the household of the commander of the Syrian army, Naaman. The young Israelite girl, whose name the Bible does not even record, was the one who showed the way of salvation to Naaman. And as the story unfolds, we are told that one day this young slave girl said to her mistress, Naaman's wife, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." Verses 4, 5, and 6, Naaman goes to the king, tells him the situation. Naaman's wife believed the words of her female slave, and she passed them on to her husband, who in turn passed them on to his lord, the king of Syria. But there was an initial challenge, following protocol. Neither Naaman nor his wife doubted the testimony of the servant girl, but there was one looming challenge, following protocol. Here's the issue. How does a Syrian military commander like Naaman go about requesting the help of an Israelite prophet? This prophet was, of course, an Israelite of Yahweh. In Elisha's going to him for a healing, Naaman's going to him for a healing would be admitting that his Syrian gods were powerless to heal him, and that only Israel's God could do so. It also placed Naaman in the awkward position of having to return to Israel, a country that he had brutalized militarily in the past as head of the Syrian army. And now he was the one desperately hurting and needy and obliged to seek help from his former victims. To do so, he would have to follow protocol by first obtaining the assistance of an influential leader in Israel. And that, of course, would be Jehoram, the king. So Naaman went to his own king, the king of Syria. He obtained his king's permission to go to Israel and seek the prophet Elisha for a healing. His king wrote a letter to King Jehoram of Israel, politely demanding that he cooperate in assisting Naaman to be healed. The king of Syria's request was one that Jehoram, the king of Israel, could hardly refuse, and yet it seemed that he had no way of fulfilling it. As we can see, however, this is or should not have really been a problem at all for Jehoram, the king of Israel. There was no close relationship between King Jehoram of Israel and the prophet Elisha of Israel. Certainly not as there should have been. King Jehoram should have just simply called for Elisha the prophet, who could heal Naaman. But because of his relationship or non-relationship with God and previous kings of Israel who had ceased to seek divine guidance, and because they further assumed that the prophets always spoke against them and their kingship, it never entered Jehoram's mind to turn to Elisha for help when he was in trouble, and so he didn't. And we read in verse 7, that his reaction was of fear and trembling. It caused an upheaval at his court. He saw this letter presented to him as something very serious, maybe even a provocation of war. And that's why he tore his clothes in anger and despair, because he knew it would be difficult to fulfill the request, but nevertheless he had no choice. He didn't know what to do. Fortunately, Elisha, as we read in verse 8, took the initiative. He heard about this message that the king of Israel had received and then torn his own robes. So he took the initiative. When he heard that the king had torn his clothes, he immediately sent word to the king, rebuking him for his dramatic act of distress, tearing garments. It was both unnecessary and inappropriate. Again, what he should have done, King Jehoram, was to simply send Elisha to heal Naaman, thereby showing Naaman that the God of Israel was supreme and there was indeed a prophet in Israel. Finally, Naaman goes with his horses and chariots, arrives at the door of Elisha's house in Samaria. And he came there with a great entourage, horses, chariots, 10 talents of silver, shekels, gold, changes of clothing. All of this he thought perhaps would impress Elisha and facilitate the prophet's healing of him. Upon arriving at the door, all he gets is a message from a messenger, from Elisha the prophet. It says, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed." No acknowledgement, no greeting from Elisha from inside the house. Simply, instructions, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed. Elisha did not even bother to come out of the house to speak to Naaman personally. But of course, as we know, he had a reason to teach Naaman humility and to break his pride. And that's why he sent someone else out to deliver the message. Naaman had to first be cured of pride if he was to receive his miracle. 1 Peter 5:5 says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Every sinner has to learn that to approach God, it should be in the awareness of his or her own unworthiness. There's no sense in trying to improve oneself or earn salvation through one's own merits. We come to the Lord as we are, as lost sinners, and that is how God accepts us, by free grace. Verse 11. After all of this has happened, Naaman goes away angry. He did not like or understand what was happening. He couldn't believe Elisha's instructions. They seemed so strange and even bizarre. What an order! Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times. Surely Naaman must have thought to himself, were not the clear and watery rivers of Damascus better than this narrow and muddy Jordan River? And moreover, if that was Elisha's so-called cure, he could have simply taken a bath at home. He could have come up with the remedy himself. It would only be later that he recognized that there was no God in all the earth except in Israel. Verse 13, Naaman's servants went to him, trying to change his mind. They reasoned with him. They reminded him that he was desperately in need of a healing and might have to do something unique or different in order to cure his affliction, something perhaps even more costly or difficult. But they knew he was capable of this. And that being the case, they argued if he was willing to do something great, something large or difficult, then why would he not be more than willing to do something less, something smaller or easier? Going into the Jordan River, immersing himself 7 times was a whole lot easier. In short, they asked him why would he be troubled by meeting a small demand when he was willing to meet a large demand. We know the answer, of course. Pride. He finally grasps the logic of the argument and he submits. And in the final verse we read that he went down, dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, and as the man of God had told him, his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. So he went to the Jordan, dipped himself, completed the process, and was completely healed. It is to Naaman's credit that he heeded the words of his servants. Yet it must have been very difficult for him to humble himself so much in the presence of his inferiors. Imagine he had to come down from his high chariot, take off all his clothes, and immerse himself in the dark and muddy water of the Jordan River. But he did it. Setting aside his arrogance and pride, he complied with the saying of the man of God, as our verse says, by simply obeying. So let's step back. In a nutshell, what's this story about? We have Naaman, the commander-in-chief of his army in Syria. He finds direction through a captive servant, his wife's slave. Naaman, the conqueror, finds help in a conquered nation, Israel. Naaman, the highly regarded man, learns of his treatment from a lowly prophet, Elisha. Naaman, the wealthy and valiant soldier, is cured in a dirty river, the Jordan. What can we learn from all of this? Well, just a few thoughts and reflections on this. And let's begin with this one. The idea of support from the unexpected. That's the first reflection. Support from the unexpected. Much of the sadness and disappointment experienced by a sick person today centers around the sense by the sick person that people they had counted on, who they thought would always be there for them, especially in their hour of need, have abandoned them. And it becomes all the more worse when this lack of love and support come from family and friends. And yet, surprisingly enough, sometimes the love and support comes from a total stranger or people we never expected to reach out and comfort or help us, to heal us of our wounds. This is another way that God provides for his children. His proof that he wishes only health and wholeness for us. And so he provides relief and comfort through the bringing of total strangers into our lives who by word or deed help us through our suffering and pain. The wonder of it is that they may even be people we have never even been close to. People with whom we've had disagreements or misunderstandings in the past. People who have even wronged us in the past. And yet, through God's infinite mercy and grace, they have become messengers of hope to the sick and the dying. The young slave girl in today's story was such a person in the life of Naaman. This Israelite slave girl was a most remarkable person. She had every reason to hate Naaman and his wife. Her master Naaman had planned and led many raids against Israel in the past, resulting in the deaths of many, perhaps including even this young girl's parents, if not to say her friends and acquaintances. And yet, instead of hating her master Naaman, gloating in his misfortune, or taking pleasure in his humiliating disease, she showed compassion. She was not intimidated by his power, position, or prestige. She simply saw his pain, called it by name, knew of a pain reliever, the prophet Elisha, and told Naaman's wife where he could get that relief. She seemed to genuinely care about the well-being of her master and her mistress. In this regard, she's very much like Daniel, who in his youth was also torn away from his country and his family by an enemy of Israel. Still, he found no pleasure in having to inform the king, Nebuchadnezzar, that the prophecy that he had received, Daniel that is, as explained by Nebuchadnezzar, foretold some very sad and humbling days ahead for that king. What if? Imagine if Naaman and his wife had despised and or demeaned this girl because she was a captive from Israel, or Naaman's family intimidated her or oppressed her to the point that she had no confidence to say anything, let alone talk about Naaman's leprosy. Naaman's healing and salvation are directly attributable to the faithfulness of this young girl. And there's a New Testament application here. We likewise, as believers, are to be representatives, like the little girl, ambassadors for Christ, and we should be able, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, to give an account for the hope that is in us. I wonder if you have this high calling. If not, maybe it's because you cannot recall in your own life times when hope for your health came in the person and presence of a stranger. Someone maybe you weren't even close to when you were healthy. Help and friendship can come from the most unexpected places. So instead of looking back at the empty places or spaces where people should be in our lives, we should look forward and be open to the possibility that perhaps other people, maybe people whom we've never even met, can often support us in our time of suffering and sorrow. It's a matter of people touching people at their point of need. Another thought regarding today's message is the idea of the healing power of touch. More specifically, leprosy and loneliness. The untouchability factor. As we've learned thus far, Naaman was a leper, and the horrendous impact of this disease on his life cannot be overestimated. Leprosy was the AIDS of Naaman's day. Lepers were isolated and humiliated. They were outcasts, the original untouchables. They were forced to wear torn clothing and shout, "Unclean, unclean," anytime they encountered an uninfected person. Leprosy was the most feared disease of the day. It was extremely contagious and in many cases incurable. And in its worst form, it led to death. Granted, Naaman's leprosy was probably in its early stages, and thus in a mild form. He could still conceal it, but eventually his clothing would not hide it from view. People might now treat him normally, but as his disease progressed, the time would come when nobody would want to be anywhere near him, to touch him, or be touched by him. Any kind of close physical contact would be unthinkable. Does that sound familiar? Well, we know what's that like, having undergone and still undergoing the pandemic and some of its consequences. Then as now, the lack of touch would have immediate negative consequences and cause possible long-term harm to health and wholeness as well. The absence of a meaningful touch in the course of normal personal relationships can be disastrous over time. Why? Because it numbs. It desensitizes. The physical senses are hampered and then ultimately cease. And things involving touch and feeling are absent from one's body. Again, the current pandemic and its accompanying social distancing protocols have painfully highlighted this fact. No handshakes, no pats on the back, no intimate embracing, and so forth. And these are simple but basic gestures of everyday life. They're vital expressions of love, care, and affection. If this were not so, why is it that when we are away from our spouse and child, we long for their embrace? Why is it that we unconsciously reach out to grasp and squeeze the widow's hand at her husband's funeral? Why is it that we sympathetically pat the shoulder of a sad member of a losing basketball team? Why do we bear hug a long-lost friend? Why is it that we hold our babies so much? And why is it that when our daughter is sad, she says, "Hold me, Daddy"? Touch brings comfort. Touch conveys acceptance. Touch promotes health. Touch imparts wholeness. Can you imagine stumbling through life without being touched? Without someone holding your hand when you are lost? Without someone rubbing your back when it is sore? Without someone slapping you on the shoulder for a job well done? Can you imagine any of that? Naaman did not have to, because loss of touch was soon to become his daily death sentence, his ever-present reality. We all need a touch. And most importantly, if we are honest with ourselves, we all desperately need the touch of God most of all. But that requires submission and humility. It doesn't come easy. It certainly didn't for Naaman, and that's why he initially walked away from God's healing hand, administered by the words of the prophet Elisha. Naaman had to first divest himself of his pride and humble himself in order to receive God's grace. And we have to do the same thing. You know, we may not be lepers in a physical sense today, but we are surely lepers in a spiritual sense. The sin-sickness connection that we have discussed previously in other messages should remain paramount in our thinking here. We have to realize that we've all been infected already with this sickness. And like leprosy, sin is an infectious disease which spreads insidiously and eventually affects the entire body. And furthermore, as lepers, we are like the living dead. Aaron, in speaking about his sister, said she was as one dead, whose flesh is half consumed. And likewise, as sinners, we are dead in our trespasses and sins and alienated from the life of God. The cure? That's easy. It's the same one that Naaman found. Almighty God. Only God can cure us and make us alive. And so that raises the question, the challenge. Are you willing to humble yourself before God so He can touch you? Will you be obedient to His instructions so that He can heal you of whatever afflicts you? I hope you will. Because if you do, you can become like Naaman, a man who went from being a sick man to a healed man, an ungodly man who became a godly man, a lost man who became a saved man, a great man who became a gracious man, and from a commander of men became a servant of the Lord. He had felt the touch of God and was changed forevermore. We all need that touch. You do. I do. We all desperately need the touch of God. So the question again is, will you humble yourself before God so that He can touch you? Will you be obedient to His instruction so that He can heal you? That is the question. Let us pray. Sovereign Lord, Holy Redeemer and God of mercy, hear our prayer. Thank you for this morning's message, this reminder that we are all lepers to a degree spiritually and are all desperately in need of help and healing. Our simple prayer is this: do not allow us to have to scrape bottom before we can start up. Don't allow us to have to look at death before we can see life. Don't allow us to taste so much pain before we can experience joy. Instead, enable us to first humble ourselves to lowly places and lowly people before we can expect the hand of God to lift us up, giving us the health and the wholeness that we need. All these things we ask, as we always do, in the mighty name of our sovereign Lord and our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.